Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of session 15 of Pre-Socratics through Augustine, also called History of Philosophy 1. We continue to talk about Plato's Republic, about the middle books, and about the so-called two worlds doctrine. Once Socrates refuted some of the views that other people hold about what is goodness, what is the good, including the view that we mentioned last time, namely that pleasure is the good. His interlocutors, Glaucon and Adeimantus, say, the things that other people think apparently are all misguided. Why don't you tell us, Socrates, what you think about the good? And Socrates says, well, I don't know what the good is. And I'm not going to tell you what I believe or opine about goodness. Because as we have discussed, beliefs or opinions, doxa, without knowledge, are shameful and blind. And that is, in and of itself, a quite interesting formulation that he says that beliefs or doxa without knowledge are shameful and blind. So one way to think about that is just that Socrates thinks that if someone doesn't have knowledge and merely has a belief, then there is something ethically worrisome about them just going ahead and asserting it. Now, instead of doing that, Socrates says, his interlocutors don't give up and they say, we still kind of want to know what you think. And he says, I will give you instead metaphors or similes, images. And that is a way, as it were, of not asserting what seems to him, but of nevertheless somehow expressing it in such a way that others can engage with it. And the three similes or metaphors that Socrates then mentions or explains or describes are very famous. They are called the sun, the line, and the cave. And for now, we only talk about the line, the simile of the line. The line precisifies the so-called two worlds doctrine. So it precisifies this distinction between two metaphysical domains, where we have the intelligible and forms on the one hand, and knowledge as the kind of cognitive access to it. And then the perceptible on the other hand, and doxa as the kind of cognitive access to it. It precisifies that, so far that is merely a dichotomy between two large domains and their typical kind of, or their characteristic kind of cognitive access. And now each of these domains is subdivided further. The higher domain, that of intelligibles, is subdivided into knowledge of the forms as the highest kind of knowledge and as engaging with the highest kind of entity. And what is characteristic of that knowledge, Socrates says, is that it is unhypothetical. Now, think back to the passages in the Republic and the Meno that we discussed where Socrates was using hypotheses. When in inquiry you use hypotheses, then your conclusions are also going to be hypothetical. So that is maybe a very important dimension of inquiry, but it's not going to be the highest kind of inquiry. And that is the second chunk of the knowledge range of the line. That is not the highest chunk, it's the second highest, where the thought is, well, there is a lot of kind of theorizing and thinking where we work with hypotheses. And that kind of thinking is not about the forms, not quite. It is about what Socrates calls models. And it's also presumably, or at least scholars think, about so-called mathematical entities. Now, what I want to talk about a little more now is the lower domain of the line, the domain of doxa and the perceptible. So far, when we talked about perceptible things, we were using examples like the cup or the tree, items in the world, particular material items in the world that are perceptible. And now Plato introduces a new sort of subdivision for the domain of the perceptible, where he says, well, that is only one of the kinds of things that are perceptible. In addition to them, in addition to the tree, in addition to the cup, and so on and so forth, there are also images and shadows and reflections thereof. And these images and shadows and reflections of material perceptible things, they are the lowest metaphysical domain of the line, and a distinctive kind of doxa, which Plato calls akasia, is the type of cognitive access to them. And for the homework assignment today, I just want to invite you to think a little bit about why might one make that distinction. And for Plato, it is a really important distinction. It's, I think, a distinctively interesting dimension of his metaphysics that he makes that distinction. Here's sort of roughly how you can think about it. Say if you have a painting of Odysseus and his ship and his companions and an island or whatever, waves of the ocean, then you could say, well, that is an image of persons and of a ship and of the waves and so on. So that's an image of these material perceptible things. And then in addition to paintings, we have, let's say, stories, we have songs, we have architecture that is not just sort of material stuff, it is also designed in this or that way. And Plato's very interested in the way in which the world as a whole has this sort of layer of images, this layer of being designed. And he thinks that that is actually a kind of a world we live in some way, where you can imagine that you get up in the morning and you listen to music and then you read a story and so on and so forth. You move to a city where all the buildings are designed in one way or another. Plato thinks it is genuinely a layer of reality, that there is this sort of image dimension to it. And for your homework, I want you to come up with an example of some particular item, something, like a cup, but, take your own example, some particular perceptible item where you think it has sort of both dimensions of the lower chunk of the line. It is both a perceptible material item and it has this sort of image dimension.